The notification sound from my phone cut through the quiet of my hospital room like a knife. 6 months post-surgery, and I was finally feeling human again. The titanium plate in my skull had stopped aching. My vision was crystal clear, and for the first time since the accident, I felt ready to rejoin the world. I reached for my phone, expecting maybe a get-well message from a friend or an update from my physical therapist. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Our family group chat, the one where we usually shared holiday photos and birthday wishes, displayed a message from my sister Rebecca that would change everything. One down, inheritance to go. Below it, she'd sent a photo of our grandfather's will, with my name circled in red ink. The timestamp showed she'd posted it just minutes after I'd been wheeled into surgery 6 months ago, when the doctors weren't sure I'd even wake up. My hands trembled as I scrolled up through months of messages I'd missed during my recovery. Rebecca discussing my condition with our cousins. Uncle Tom calculating how my portion of the inheritance would be divided if I didn't make it. Aunt Karen suggesting they start making arrangements for my assets. All of this while I'd been fighting for my life, learning to walk again, rebuilding my speech patterns word by word. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that during those 6 months of supposed helplessness, I hadn't just been recovering, I'd been building something extraordinary, something that would make their petty inheritance schemes look like pocket change. They thought brain surgery had weakened me, made me vulnerable, turned me into someone to pity and plot against. They had no idea how wrong they were. The Mitchell family Sunday dinner was exactly as I remembered it from before the accident. The same oak dining table that had hosted 3 generations of conversations, the same mismatched chairs that nobody ever bothered to replace, and the same tension that always seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of our family gatherings. I sat quietly in the corner chair, the one with the wobbly leg that nobody else wanted, picking at the pot roast Linda had prepared with her usual efficiency and complete lack of seasoning. Rebecca dominated the conversation as always, her voice carrying that particular tone of superiority that had grated on my nerves since childhood. She was going on about her new promotion at the marketing firm, how she'd finally landed the Henderson account that everyone said was impossible to secure. Her husband Jake nodded along appreciatively, occasionally chiming in with details about their upcoming vacation to Europe, the one they'd been planning since before my surgery. David, my father, listened with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for discussions about profit margins and quarterly reports. The construction business had been good to our family for decades, and he'd built Mitchell Construction from a 2-man operation into one of Denver's most respected general contracting firms. He believed in concrete things, tangible results, measurable success. Rebecca's corporate achievements fit neatly into his worldview in a way that my pre-accident life never had. Uncle Tom was holding court from his usual spot at the head of the table, gesturing with his fork as he described the latest real estate deals he'd closed. 3 houses in Cherry Creek, 2 commercial properties downtown, and a vacation rental in Vail that was already booked solid through the next ski season. Aunt Karen kept interrupting with questions about property values and market trends, her notebook open beside her plate as she scribbled notes between bites. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, familiar and comfortable for everyone else, suffocating for me. I'd grown used to the silence during my recovery, the blessed quiet of a hospital room where nobody expected me to contribute to discussions about mortgage rates and market fluctuations. Now surrounded by the familiar chaos of family dinner, I felt like an outsider looking in through a window. "Alex is looking much better," Linda said suddenly, and I realized the entire table had gone quiet. All eyes were on me, studying my face with the kind of clinical interest usually reserved for X-rays and medical charts. "The scar is barely visible now, you'd hardly know anything happened." I touched the thin line along my left temple, where the surgeon had made his incision. The hair had grown back, covering most of the evidence, but I could still feel the slight ridge where the skin had healed. The doctors say I'm making excellent progress, I replied, keeping my voice steady and measured. Physical therapy is going well, speech therapy too. Rebecca leaned forward with what I'd learned to recognize as her concerned sister expression, the one she wore when she wanted to appear caring while fishing for information. But you're still not working right. I mean, you can't really be thinking about going back to that freelance graphic design thing, not after everything that's happened. The dismissive way she said things made my jaw clench, but I kept my expression neutral. Before the accident, I'd been building a successful design business, working with small startups and local businesses to create brand identities and marketing materials. It wasn't the kind of work that impressed my family, with their focus on traditional career paths and steady paychecks, but it had been mine. I'd been good at it, maybe even great at it, before the drunk driver had changed everything. I'm taking things slowly, I said, which was true enough. Focusing on my health right now. David nodded approvingly. Smart approach. No point in rushing back into anything stressful. The body needs time to heal properly. He'd been saying variations of this for months, always with the underlying implication that maybe this was an opportunity to consider a more stable career path, something with benefits and a retirement plan, something that wouldn't disappear if I got sick or injured again. Jake, Rebecca's husband, had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, but now he cleared his throat and looked at me with what might have been sympathy. Have you given any thought to what comes next? I mean, long-term planning. He worked in financial services, the kind of job that required him to think in terms of 5- and 10-year projections, and I could see him mentally calculating disability payments and insurance settlements. Actually, I said, setting down my fork and reaching for my phone, I've been working on something during my recovery, something I'd like to show you all. The table went silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. I could feel the weight of their skepticism, their barely concealed concern that the brain surgery had affected more than just my motor skills and speech patterns. Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Jake, the kind of wordless communication that married couples develop over years of shared experiences and mutual understanding. Alex, honey, Linda said gently, using the tone she'd perfected during my childhood, the one that was supposed to cushion disappointing news. You know, we're all just concerned about your recovery. The doctors said it could take months, maybe even years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Before you're really back to normal. Normal, the word hung in the air like a challenge. They'd been using it for months, always in the context of getting back to normal, returning to normal, finding a new normal, as if normal was something fixed and measurable, something that could be restored like a damaged building, or replaced like a broken appliance. They had no idea that normal was the last thing I wanted. Uncle Tom leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression he usually reserved for questionable business propositions. What kind of something? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Tom had survived 3 decades in Denver real estate by developing an instinct for deals that were too good to be true, and I could see him mentally cataloging all the ways that brain surgery might have impaired my judgment. I unlocked my phone and opened the app I'd been living in for the past 6 months, the one that had consumed my days and nights during the long, slow process of recovery. The interface was clean and intuitive, exactly the kind of user experience that had made me fall in love with design in the first place. But this wasn't just about design anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had grown from a simple idea into something that could change everything. It's called MindBridge, I said, turning the phone so they could see the screen. It's a platform that connects people recovering from brain injuries with others who've been through similar experiences. But it's not just a support group or a forum. It's a comprehensive ecosystem that includes medical tracking, therapy scheduling, progress monitoring, and peer support, all integrated into a single accessible interface. Rebecca squinted at the screen, her marketing background kicking in as she automatically analyzed the visual hierarchy and user interface design. It looks professional, she admitted, though her tone suggested this was somehow surprising. But Alex, there are already apps for medical stuff, lots of them. What makes this different? I'd been expecting this question for months, preparing for it during the long hours of physical therapy when my body was learning to move properly again, but my mind was free to wander and plan and strategize. The difference is that this was built by someone who actually understands what it's like, I said. Every feature, every interaction, every piece of functionality comes from lived experience. It's not a medical app built by healthy people for sick people. It's a recovery tool built by someone who's actually doing the work of recovery. David was studying the phone now, his contractor's eye automatically assessing the quality of the construction. How long have you been working on this? He asked, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. He'd assumed, like the rest of them, that my days were filled with doctor's appointments and physical therapy sessions, with maybe some television and light reading to fill the empty hours between treatments. Since about 2 weeks after I woke up, I said, when I realized that all the existing resources were designed by people who'd never actually experienced brain trauma. The disconnect between what patients need and what's available was so obvious that I couldn't ignore it. Aunt Karen had pulled out her reading glasses and was peering at the phone with the intensity she usually reserved for property contracts. But developing an app, that's a big undertaking, expensive, time-consuming. Are you sure you're not taking on too much too soon? The concern in her voice was genuine, but I could hear the subtext underneath it. The family had spent months treating me like fragile glass, something that might shatter if subjected to too much pressure or excitement. They'd been so focused on protecting me from stress and disappointment that they'd never considered the possibility that I might be capable of creating something meaningful during my recovery. I've been working with a development team, I said, which was true enough, though it didn't capture the full scope of what had actually happened. The beta testing has been incredibly positive. We've got users in 12 states now, and the feedback has been overwhelming. Jake leaned forward, his financial services background suddenly engaged. Users? You mean paying customers? I smiled, feeling the first real surge of satisfaction I'd experienced since walking into this house. The freemium model has been working well for user acquisition, but the premium subscriptions have exceeded all our projections. We're currently processing about 15,000 active users, with roughly 30% converting to paid accounts. The math was simple enough that everyone at the table could calculate the implications, but I could see them struggling to reconcile the numbers with their mental image of me as a recovering patient who could barely manage his own daily schedule. Rebecca was the first to break the silence, her voice carefully controlled but tinged with something that might have been surprise or respect, or possibly alarm. 15,000 users, she repeated, in 6 months. Alex, that's not just a hobby project, that's a real business. I nodded, enjoying the way the conversation had shifted from concern about my recovery to genuine curiosity about what I'd accomplished. The growth has been exponential. Word of mouth in the brain injury community is incredibly powerful, and the retention rates have been better than anything we projected. Tom was studying me now with the same intensity he brought to major real estate negotiations, trying to assess whether I was exaggerating or overselling, or somehow deluding myself about the scope of my achievement. What kind of revenue are we talking about? He asked, cutting straight to the heart of what he cared about most. I hesitated for just a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to savor this moment. For months, they'd been treating me like someone who needed protection and guidance, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted and whose capabilities were severely limited. Now finally, I had their complete and undivided attention. Last month, we crossed 200,000 in monthly recurring revenue, I said quietly. This month, we're on track to hit 350. The projections for Q4 are looking even better. The silence that followed was different from any that had preceded it during the evening. This wasn't the polite quiet of people waiting for someone to finish speaking, or the awkward pause that sometimes followed my slower, more deliberate post-surgery speech patterns. This was the stunned silence of people trying to recalibrate their understanding of a situation that had suddenly become much more complex than they'd anticipated. Linda was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. $200,000. In 1 month. Monthly recurring revenue, I corrected gently, which means that's what we're bringing in every month from existing subscribers, not counting new signups or one-time purchases. The total monthly revenue is actually closer to $400,000 when you factor in everything else. David's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth, and he set it down carefully on his plate. As someone who'd built his own business from nothing, he understood better than anyone else at the table what those numbers actually meant. Alex, he said slowly, are you telling us that you've built $1 million business while recovering from brain surgery? I took a sip of water, letting the question hang in the air for a moment before responding. The valuation is actually quite a bit higher than that, I said. We just closed a Series A funding round last week. $12 million, led by Denver Tech Ventures, with participation from 3 other VC firms. The words hit the table like a physical force, and I could see each family member processing the information in their own way. Rebecca's marketing mind was calculating market penetration and growth potential. Jake was thinking about investment returns and equity percentages. Tom was probably trying to figure out how real estate compared to tech startups in terms of long-term wealth building. Karen was scribbling numbers in her notebook, trying to keep up with the financial implications of what I'd just revealed. But it was David's reaction that meant the most to me. I could see him looking at me with new eyes, reassessing everything he thought he knew about my capabilities and my future prospects. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't seeing a damaged son who needed protection and guidance. He was seeing a successful entrepreneur who'd accomplished something remarkable under the most challenging possible circumstances. $12 million, he repeated, as if saying the number out loud might help him understand it better. For an app you built while you were recovering from surgery, for a platform that's already helping thousands of people navigate one of the most challenging experiences a person can face, I corrected. The money is just a reflection of the value we're creating for our users. Rebecca had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from her own mental calculations with an expression I'd never seen before. It might have been admiration, or possibly concern, or maybe just confusion about how the family dynamics had suddenly shifted so dramatically. Alex, she said carefully, this is incredible. I mean genuinely incredible. But why didn't you tell us? Why keep it secret for so long? I looked around the table at their faces, all focused on me with an intensity that was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. How could I explain that I'd needed the silence, the space to build something without their doubts and concerns and well-meaning advice? How could I tell them that their protective instincts, while genuinely caring, had made me feel diminished and incapable? Because I needed to prove it to myself first, I said finally, and because I knew that if I told you what I was working on, you'd try to talk me out of it. You'd worry about the stress, about whether I was pushing myself too hard, about whether I was thinking clearly. You'd want to protect me from the possibility of failure. The truth of that statement was written on their faces, and I could see them recognizing their own protective impulses in my words. They had been trying to shield me from disappointment and stress, but in doing so, they'd also been shielding me from the possibility of achievement and growth. Linda reached across the table and touched my hand, her eyes bright with tears I hadn't expected. We were so scared, she said softly. When they wheeled you into surgery, the doctors said there was a chance you might not wake up the same person. We just wanted to keep you safe. I squeezed her hand, feeling a rush of affection for this woman who'd spent months worrying about my recovery, who'd driven me to countless medical appointments and therapy sessions, who'd never once questioned my decision to move back home during the most difficult period of my life. "I know," I said, "and I'm grateful for that. But I needed to find out who I was going to be after the surgery, and I couldn't do that with everyone watching and worrying and trying to manage my decisions." Tom was still processing the financial implications of what I'd shared, his real estate mind trying to categorize this new information alongside everything else he knew about building wealth and creating value. "So what happens now?" he asked. "With the funding, with the business? What's the next step?" I smiled, feeling more confident and more like myself than I had since before the accident. "We're hiring. Expanding the development team, building out the medical advisory board, launching in 3 new markets. The goal is to be the definitive platform for brain injury recovery and support." "And after that?" Jake asked, his financial services background focused on long-term planning and exit strategies. "After that, we start working on the next challenge," I said. "Brain injury is just the beginning. There are millions of people dealing with various forms of neurological recovery and rehabilitation, and most of the existing resources are fragmented, outdated, or designed by people who've never experienced what they're trying to solve." Rebecca was studying me with what looked like a combination of pride and amazement. "Alex, this is incredible. I mean, I work in marketing, and I know how hard it is to build user engagement and retention in any market, let alone something as specialized as medical recovery. What you've accomplished is extraordinary." For the first time in months, I felt like she was seeing me as an equal rather than as someone who needed her concern and guidance. It was a sensation I'd missed more than I'd realized, the feeling of being respected for my capabilities rather than pitied for my limitations. The conversation continued for another hour, with questions about technical architecture, user acquisition strategies, competitive landscape analysis, and revenue projections. My family, who had spent months carefully avoiding any discussion that might stress or overwhelm me, were now engaging with me as a successful entrepreneur who'd accomplished something they were still struggling to fully comprehend. As the evening wound down, and people began clearing dishes and gathering coats, David pulled me aside for a private conversation. We stood on the back deck, looking out at the Denver skyline with the mountains visible in the distance, the same view that had been part of every family gathering for as long as I could remember. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "We all do. We were so focused on protecting you that we never considered what you might be capable of accomplishing on your own." I leaned against the deck railing, feeling the cool evening air on my face, and thinking about how different this conversation was from the ones we'd been having for months. "You don't need to apologize for caring about my recovery," I said. "But I'm not the same person I was before the accident, and I'm not the broken person you were afraid I might become. I'm something new, something different, and that's not necessarily a bad thing." He nodded, still processing everything I'd shared during dinner. $12 million, he said again, shaking his head, "from an idea you developed while recovering from brain surgery. It's remarkable, Alex, truly remarkable." I smiled, feeling a sense of completion that had been missing since the accident. "The brain surgery didn't break me, Dad, it just showed me what I was really capable of when everything else was stripped away." As I drove home that night, my phone buzzed with notifications from the family group chat, the same one where Rebecca had posted that cruel message about inheritance 6 months ago. But now the tone was completely different. Messages of congratulations, requests for more details about the business, questions about how they could help or support the expansion plans. I thought about that moment in the hospital when I'd first seen Rebecca's message, the shock and hurt of discovering how my family really saw me when they thought I couldn't see them back. It had been devastating at the time, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me exactly what I needed to prove, and to whom. Now, as I pulled into the driveway of my apartment complex, I realized that I'd proven something much more important than my family's assumptions wrong. I'd proven to myself that the accident hadn't diminished me or limited my potential. If anything, it had forced me to discover capabilities and resilience I'd never known I possessed. The brain surgery that was supposed to have weakened me had actually made me stronger. The recovery period that was supposed to have been about returning to my old life had instead become about building something entirely new, and the family that had once seen me as someone to inherit from had now seen me become someone worth learning from. Tomorrow, I'd be back in my real office, not the small apartment workspace my family imagined, but the downtown Denver headquarters of MindBridge Technologies, working with a team of 12 full-time employees and dozens of contractors to help thousands of people navigate their own recovery journeys. But tonight, for the first time in 6 months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, exactly who I was meant to be, and exactly as capable as I'd always believed myself to be, even when no one else could see it. Part 2. The Monday morning after our family dinner felt different than any morning I'd experienced since the accident. I woke up in my small apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows, and a sense of anticipation that had been absent from my life for months. Today wasn't just another day of recovery appointments and physical therapy sessions. Today was the day I would finally step back into the world I'd been building in secret, the world my family was just beginning to understand existed. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Rebecca, 12 text messages from various family members, and 3 voicemails from Uncle Tom. The family group chat had exploded overnight with questions, concerns, and what appeared to be a heated discussion between my parents about whether they should have known what I was working on. I scrolled through the messages while brewing coffee, amused by the sudden shift from protective concern to intense curiosity about my business operations. Rebecca's texts ranged from apologetic to excited to slightly frantic. She wanted to know about market positioning, competitive analysis, user demographics, and growth projections. Jake had sent a series of financial questions that would have made perfect sense if he'd been considering an investment opportunity rather than trying to understand what his brother-in-law had accomplished during his recovery period. Even Aunt Karen had chimed in with questions about intellectual property protection and trademark registration, apparently having stayed up late researching startup fundamentals. I finished my coffee and gathered the materials I'd need for what was going to be a very different kind of day. For months, I'd been managing MindBridge remotely, participating in video conferences from my apartment, reviewing development progress on my laptop, and conducting user interviews from the comfort of my living room. My family had assumed this was because I wasn't physically or mentally ready to return to a traditional work environment. The reality was that I'd been running a rapidly growing technology company from what they perceived as my recovery space. The drive to downtown Denver took me through neighborhoods I'd known my entire life, past construction sites, where Mitchell construction trucks were visible among the equipment and workers. My father's business had shaped the landscape of this city in small but meaningful ways, building the infrastructure that allowed families and businesses to grow and thrive. Now I was doing something similar, but in a digital space rather than a physical one, creating platforms that allowed people to rebuild their lives rather than their buildings. MindBridge Technologies occupied 2 floors of a sleek glass building in the lower downtown district, with mountain views from the conference rooms, and an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration and innovation. I'd chosen the location carefully, wanting to be close enough to the medical district to maintain relationships with healthcare providers while remaining in the heart of Denver's emerging tech corridor. The space was designed to be accessible and welcoming, reflecting the same principles that guided our platform development. Emma Thompson, my chief technology officer, was waiting for me in the lobby with a tablet full of updates and a coffee that was exactly the way I liked it. Emma had been the first person I'd hired after the initial proof of concept was completed, and she'd become not just a key team member but a trusted friend who understood both the technical challenges and the personal mission behind everything we were building. The Forbes interview confirmed for Thursday, she said as we walked toward the elevator. TechCrunch wants to do a feature story about founder journey narratives in healthcare tech. And we got the final approval from the Medical Advisory Board for the new cognitive assessment module. I nodded, processing the information while mentally preparing for a day that would be dramatically different from the quiet, controlled environment I'd been operating in for months. The media attention was something I'd been anticipating but also dreading, knowing that it would bring scrutiny and visibility that might be difficult to manage alongside my ongoing recovery process. The elevator opened onto our main floor, revealing a bustling workspace filled with developers, designers, user experience researchers, and customer support specialists. The energy was immediately apparent, the kind of focused intensity that comes from a team working on something they believe in. These people had been building MindBridge while I was attending family dinners, where my capabilities were questioned and my future prospects were discussed in hushed, concerned tones. Marcus Johnson, our head of user experience, approached with a laptop showing the latest analytics dashboard. User engagement was up 37% from the previous month, retention rates were exceeding all projections, and the feedback scores were consistently high across all demographic segments. Most importantly, the community features were creating exactly the kind of supportive environment we'd envisioned when we first started developing the platform. The user testimonials from last week are incredible, Marcus said, scrolling through a collection of messages from people whose lives had been transformed by the platform. There's a woman in Phoenix who says MindBridge helped her navigate the first 6 months after her stroke better than any of the traditional medical resources she was given. A veteran in Seattle credits the peer support network with helping him manage post-concussion syndrome symptoms that weren't being addressed by his VA care team. These stories were the real measure of our success, beyond the financial metrics and growth projections that had impressed my family the night before. Every user who found hope, connection, or practical support through our platform represented a validation of the vision that had sustained me through the most difficult period of my life. We weren't just building a profitable business, we were creating tools that helped people reclaim their lives after devastating neurological events. Williams, the neurosurgeon who had performed my surgery, had agreed to serve on our medical advisory board after seeing the platform's potential to address gaps in post-surgical care and long-term recovery support. His involvement had opened doors with other medical professionals and helped establish credibility within the healthcare community. Yesterday's family dinner had been the first time I'd publicly discussed the business, but we'd been building relationships with medical institutions and insurance providers for months. The morning passed quickly with meetings, development reviews, and strategic planning sessions. I found myself energized by the pace and complexity of the work in a way that surprised me. For months, my family had been encouraging me to take things slowly, to avoid stress and overstimulation, to focus primarily on my physical and cognitive recovery. But being back in this environment, surrounded by challenging problems and ambitious goals, felt more therapeutic than any of the formal treatment programs I'd completed. Emma knocked on my office door just before lunch, holding her phone with an expression that suggested important news. Rebecca Mitchell called the main number, she said. She wants to schedule a meeting to discuss potential marketing collaboration opportunities. Should I transfer her to your calendar system? I laughed, remembering how Rebecca had spent months treating me like someone who needed simplified explanations and careful management of his daily schedule. Now she was trying to schedule formal business meetings through my corporate communications channels. The transformation in her perception of my capabilities was both gratifying and slightly surreal. Set up a call for later this week, I said. And Emma, when you talk to her, treat her like any other potential business partner, professional courtesy, but no special consideration because she's family. The afternoon brought a series of investor update calls, including a detailed discussion with Denver Tech Ventures about our expansion timeline and funding requirements for the next phase of development. The conversation was technical and strategic, covering market penetration analysis, competitive positioning, and scalability challenges. These were the kinds of discussions I'd been having regularly for months, while my family had been debating whether I was ready to handle basic daily responsibilities. As the day wound down, I received a text from David asking if he could visit the office sometime soon. He wanted to see what I'd built, to understand the scope and scale of the operation I'd been running while he'd been worrying about my recovery progress. I replied that he was welcome anytime, then added that he might want to bring Rebecca and Jake if they were serious about understanding the business model and growth strategy. The evening commute gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I'd been the family member who needed protection and guidance, whose future prospects were uncertain and whose current capabilities were questioned. Today I was fielding interview requests from major media outlets and investor inquiries from venture capital firms across the country. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot. The caller ID showed Linda, and I could hear the mixture of pride and bewilderment in her voice as soon as I answered. "Alex, honey, I've been thinking about last night all day," she said. "I keep trying to understand how you accomplished so much while we thought you were just focused on getting better. Were you hiding this from us? Were you worried we wouldn't support you?" I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet of my car, considering how to respond to a question that touched on months of complex emotions and careful choices. "I wasn't hiding it exactly," I said finally. "But I needed space to figure out who I was going to be after the surgery. I needed to prove to myself that I could still create something meaningful, and I couldn't do that with everyone watching and worrying about whether I was pushing too hard or thinking clearly." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her processing the implications of what I'd said. "We were trying to protect you," she said softly. "The doctors said recovery could take years, and we wanted to make sure you didn't put too much pressure on yourself too soon." "I know," I replied, "and I'm grateful for that care and concern. But I also needed to discover what my new normal was going to look like, and that meant taking some risks and facing some challenges that you might not have been comfortable with if you'd known about them." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering territory we'd never discussed before about autonomy, recovery, family dynamics, and the difference between protection and empowerment. By the time we hung up, I felt like we'd reached a new understanding about my capabilities and my future prospects. That night, I sat in my apartment looking out at the Denver skyline and thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been wheeled into surgery not knowing whether I'd wake up as the same person. The recovery had been challenging in ways I'd never anticipated, requiring not just physical healing but a complete reconstruction of my sense of identity and capability. The brain surgery that was supposed to have diminished me had instead revealed reserves of resilience and creativity I'd never known I possessed. The family that had once seen me as someone who needed their protection and guidance now saw me as someone who had built something remarkable while they weren't watching. And the platform I'd created to help others navigate neurological recovery had become a thriving business that was changing lives on a scale I'd never imagined possible. Part 3. The remainder of the week unfolded like a carefully choreographed reveal of everything I'd been building while my family thought I was simply recovering. Each day brought new meetings, new opportunities, and new conversations that highlighted just how completely their understanding of my situation had been transformed by Sunday's dinner revelation. Wednesday morning brought the Forbes interview, conducted in our downtown conference room with the Denver skyline providing an impressive backdrop. The journalist, Patricia Chen, had done her research thoroughly, asking detailed questions about the intersection of personal experience and entrepreneurial innovation in healthcare technology. She was particularly interested in how my own recovery journey had informed the platform's development and user experience design. "There's something uniquely authentic about solutions created by people who have actually lived through the problems they're trying to solve," Patricia said, scrolling through screenshots of the MindBridge interface on her tablet. "Can you talk about how your personal experience shaped the technical architecture and user flow?" I explained how traditional medical applications were often designed by healthy people making assumptions about what patients might need, resulting in interfaces that were difficult to navigate for people dealing with cognitive challenges, fatigue, or motor skill issues. MindBridge had been built from the ground up with these limitations in mind, incorporating features like voice-to-text functionality, simplified navigation paths, and customizable interface options that could be adjusted based on individual recovery needs. "Every feature we've implemented has been tested by real users dealing with real recovery challenges," I continued. We don't just collect user feedback, we involve our community in the actual development process. They help us identify pain points and usability issues that might not be obvious to traditional development teams. The interview covered technical details, business model innovation, market penetration strategies, and growth projections, but it also delved into the personal narrative that had made MindBridge possible. Patricia was skilled at drawing out the human elements of the story without sensationalizing the medical aspects or recovery challenges. What would you say to other entrepreneurs who might be facing significant personal challenges while trying to build their businesses? She asked as we wrapped up the formal interview portion. I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the times during my recovery when doubt and uncertainty had threatened to derail the entire project. I'd say that sometimes our biggest limitations can become our greatest sources of innovation, I replied. The constraints I faced during recovery forced me to think differently about product development, user experience, and market validation. I couldn't rely on traditional approaches because my situation wasn't traditional. After Patricia left, Emma showed me the preliminary media coverage that was already starting to appear online. TechCrunch had picked up the story from their industry sources, focusing on the funding round and valuation metrics. Healthcare Innovation Weekly was preparing a feature about patient-centered design in medical technology. Even the Denver Business Journal was planning a profile about local entrepreneurs making national impact. The attention was gratifying but also slightly overwhelming. For months, I'd been working in relative anonymity, building something important without the pressure of public scrutiny or external expectations. Now suddenly there were interview requests, speaking invitations, and partnership proposals arriving daily. The business I'd created during my recovery was becoming a public success story, complete with all the visibility and responsibility that entailed. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to the office. Rebecca arrived unannounced, dressed in her most professional business attire, and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested she'd prepared extensively for this meeting. Emma escorted her to my office, where she stood for a moment looking around at the space with an expression of barely concealed amazement. "This is incredible, Alex," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I mean, I knew you said you had an office, but this is a real operation. How many people work here?" 12 full-time employees, plus another 8 contractors and consultants working on specific projects, I replied. "We're planning to add 6 more positions over the next quarter, including a dedicated user research specialist and a clinical partnerships coordinator." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a tablet loaded with marketing analysis and competitive research. Apparently, she'd spent the past few days studying the healthcare technology market, user acquisition strategies, and brand positioning approaches for medical applications. Her thoroughness was impressive, even if it highlighted how completely she'd underestimated the scope of what I'd been working on. "I've been thinking about potential collaboration opportunities," she said, launching into a presentation about integrated marketing campaigns, social media strategy, and brand awareness initiatives. "My firm has experience with healthcare accounts, and I think we could develop some really effective approaches for expanding your user base." I listened politely while she outlined various marketing concepts and partnership proposals, appreciating her enthusiasm while also noting the assumptions underlying her presentation. She was approaching MindBridge as if it were a traditional business-to-consumer application, rather than a specialized platform serving a specific community with unique needs and sensitivities. "The marketing challenges are different in this space," I explained when she finished her presentation. "Our users aren't typical consumers making discretionary purchasing decisions, they're people dealing with life-altering medical situations, often feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed. The messaging has to be incredibly careful, respectful, and authentic." Rebecca nodded, making notes on her tablet. "That makes sense. I hadn't fully considered the emotional complexity of the target audience. What kind of marketing approaches have been most effective so far?" I walked her through our user acquisition strategy, which relied heavily on word-of-mouth referrals, partnerships with medical professionals, and organic community growth rather than traditional advertising campaigns. The most successful outreach efforts had been educational content created by users themselves, sharing their recovery stories and explaining how the platform had helped them navigate specific challenges. We're not trying to sell people something they don't need, I continued. We're providing tools and resources for people who are already dealing with recovery challenges. The marketing approach has to reflect that reality. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering brand positioning, content strategy, community management, and partnership development. By the end of our meeting, Rebecca had a much clearer understanding of both the business opportunity and the unique responsibilities that came with serving such a vulnerable population. I owe you an apology, she said, as she gathered her materials. Not just for Sunday night, but for months of treating you like someone who couldn't handle complex decisions or challenging work. I had no idea what you were capable of accomplishing. I appreciated her directness, even as I recognized that this conversation represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. For most of our adult lives, she'd been the successful sibling with the impressive career and clear trajectory, while I'd been pursuing more unconventional paths that didn't fit neatly into traditional measures of achievement. Now suddenly, our roles had been reversed in ways that were going to require adjustment from both of us. The brain surgery didn't make me less capable, I said. If anything, it forced me to discover capabilities I didn't know I had. Sometimes the biggest challenges create the greatest opportunities for growth and innovation. Friday brought David and Tom to the office, both of them clearly curious about the operation I'd been running while they'd been discussing my recovery prospects and future limitations. They arrived together, dressed in the kind of business casual attire that suggested they were taking this visit seriously, but weren't quite sure what to expect. Emma gave them a comprehensive tour of the facilities, explaining the different functional areas and introducing them to key team members. I watched them process the scale and sophistication of the operation, clearly trying to reconcile this reality with their mental image of my post-surgery capabilities and limitations. "This is remarkable, Alex," David said, as we settled in the conference room overlooking downtown Denver. "The scope of what you've built here, the team you've assembled, the growth you've achieved, it's exactly the kind of entrepreneurial success I always hoped you might accomplish someday." Tom was studying the financial projections Emma had prepared, his real estate background helping him understand the revenue models and scalability potential. "The numbers are impressive," he said, "but I'm curious about the long-term market potential. Is brain injury recovery a large enough addressable market to sustain this kind of growth trajectory?" I explained that brain injury was just our initial focus area, chosen because of my personal experience and the obvious gaps in existing resources. The longer-term vision was to expand into other forms of neurological recovery and rehabilitation, potentially serving millions of people dealing with conditions ranging from stroke to traumatic brain injury to neurodegenerative diseases. "The market opportunity is enormous," I continued. "But more importantly, the need is enormous. There are people all over the country dealing with recovery challenges similar to what I experienced, and most of them don't have access to the kind of comprehensive, integrated support that can make the difference between thriving and merely surviving." David leaned forward, his contractor's instincts engaged by the discussion of building something substantial and lasting. "What do you need to get to the next level? Capital, connections, expertise. How can we help support what you're building here?" The question surprised me, both because of its directness and because it represented such a complete reversal from months of conversations about limiting stress and managing expectations. Now my father was asking how he could help accelerate my business growth rather than slow it down for my own protection. "The Series A funding will support our expansion plans for the next 18 months, I replied. "But there are opportunities for strategic partnerships, advisory relationships, and community connections that could be valuable as we scale." Tom was nodding, apparently seeing parallels between real estate development and technology platform development. "Building something sustainable requires the right foundation, the right team, and the right market timing," he said. "It sounds like you've got all three of those elements in place." The conversation continued through lunch, covering everything from competitive analysis to regulatory considerations to potential exit strategies. By the time they left, both David and Tom had a comprehensive understanding of what I'd built and where it was heading. More importantly, they'd seen me operating in my element, managing complex business decisions and strategic planning with the kind of competence they'd questioned just days earlier. That evening, I received a group text from the family chat asking if everyone could get together again on Sunday. Not for a traditional family dinner with awkward conversations and protective concern, but for what Rebecca described as a business update meeting, where I could share more details about our growth plans and upcoming milestones. I smiled, thinking about how completely the dynamic had shifted in less than a week. Sunday's dinner had been about protecting me from stress and managing my limitations. This Sunday's meeting would be about supporting my success and understanding my ambitions. The brain surgery that was supposed to have weakened me had instead revealed capabilities that none of us had previously recognized, including myself. Part 4. The second family gathering felt entirely different from the previous Sunday's dinner. Instead of the familiar dining room with its undertones of concern and protection, we met in my parents' home office, with laptops open and notepads ready. Rebecca had prepared an agenda, Tom had brought his business attorney, and Jake was armed with financial analysis software and investment evaluation frameworks. The transformation from protective family to potential business advisory board was both surreal and deeply satisfying. Linda had prepared coffee and light refreshments, but the atmosphere was focused and professional rather than social. Everyone understood that this wasn't a casual family update but a serious discussion about a rapidly growing business that had implications for all of us. The casual dismissal and gentle condescension that had characterized previous family interactions had been replaced by genuine respect and intense curiosity. I'd prepared a comprehensive presentation covering market analysis, user demographics, growth metrics, competitive positioning, and expansion strategy. This wasn't the simplified explanation I might have given a week earlier, but the kind of detailed business overview I'd present to potential investors or strategic partners. My family was going to see exactly what I'd built and where it was heading, without any accommodation for their previous assumptions about my capabilities. MindBridge currently serves users in 47 states and 6 countries. I began, displaying user distribution maps on my laptop screen. Our primary demographic is adults aged 25 to 65 dealing with various forms of acquired brain injury, but we're also seeing significant adoption among family members, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. Rebecca was taking detailed notes, occasionally asking questions about user acquisition costs, conversion rates, and retention metrics. Her marketing background helped her understand the challenges of building brand awareness in a specialized market while maintaining the trust and credibility essential for healthcare-related services. The user testimonials are remarkable, she said, reviewing screenshots of community posts and feedback surveys. These aren't just customer satisfaction ratings, these are life-changing impact stories. How do you measure and track those kinds of outcomes? I explained our comprehensive outcome tracking system, which monitored everything from basic platform engagement to self-reported progress metrics to clinical assessment improvements. We weren't just measuring business success, we were documenting the real-world impact of our platform on users' recovery trajectories and quality of life improvements. Tom was particularly interested in the scalability challenges and expansion opportunities. His real estate background had given him experience with rapid growth management and market expansion strategies, and he could see parallels between geographic expansion in property development and market penetration in healthcare technology. What are the regulatory considerations? He asked. Healthcare technology must have significant compliance requirements, especially when you're dealing with sensitive medical information and recovery data. I walked them through our HIPAA compliance framework, data security protocols, clinical advisory board oversight, and regulatory approval processes. These weren't topics I would have been discussing with my family a week earlier, when they were primarily concerned about whether I was managing my daily schedule appropriately and attending all my medical appointments. David was studying the financial projections with the kind of attention he usually reserved for major construction contracts. The revenue growth trajectory is impressive, he said, but what about the operational complexities? How do you manage quality control and user support as you scale this rapidly? I explained our customer support infrastructure, quality assurance protocols, and user community management systems. We built the platform to be scalable from the beginning, with automated systems handling routine functions, while human specialists focused on complex user needs and community development initiatives. The key is maintaining the personal touch that makes our platform effective, while building systems that can serve thousands of users efficiently, I continued. We're not trying to replace human connection and support, we're trying to enhance it with technology that makes it more accessible and more effective. Jake was running calculations on his laptop, modeling various growth scenarios and investment return projections. Have you considered strategic partnerships with insurance providers or healthcare systems? He asked. The cost savings potential for post-acute care management could be substantial. I'd been anticipating this question, knowing that Jake's financial services background would lead him to focus on large-scale market opportunities and institutional partnerships. We'd already begun preliminary discussions with several major insurance providers about pilot programs and outcome-based reimbursement models. Healthcare systems are increasingly interested in solutions that improve patient outcomes while reducing long-term care costs, I explained. Brain injury recovery typically involves years of ongoing therapy and support services. If we can demonstrate improved outcomes and reduced readmission rates, the business case becomes compelling for institutional partners. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, covering technical architecture, competitive analysis, international expansion opportunities, and potential acquisition scenarios. My family was engaging with MindBridge as a serious business opportunity rather than a recovery hobby project, asking the kinds of sophisticated questions that reflected their professional expertise and business experience. Aunt Karen had been relatively quiet during the formal presentation, but now she leaned forward with a question that went to the heart of everything we'd been discussing. Alex, this is obviously an incredible achievement, especially considering everything you've been through over the past 6 months, but I'm curious about the personal cost. Has building this business interfered with your recovery process? I'd been expecting this question as well, knowing that the family's protective instincts hadn't completely disappeared, even as their understanding of my capabilities had evolved. Actually, building MindBridge has been an integral part of my recovery process, I replied. Having a meaningful project to focus on, something that could help other people facing similar challenges gave me purpose and motivation during the most difficult months. Linda nodded thoughtfully. The doctors always said that staying engaged and having goals was important for neurological recovery. I just never imagined that your goal was building a multi-million-dollar business. I laughed, remembering all the conversations about setting realistic expectations and focusing on small, manageable objectives. The business grew organically from a genuine need I was experiencing during my own recovery. I wasn't setting out to build a major company, I was trying to solve problems that were making my own healing process more difficult. Rebecca was reviewing her notes, apparently formulating some kind of strategic recommendation. Alex, I think there are some significant marketing opportunities we haven't fully explored. The founder story alone is incredibly compelling, but beyond that, the authentic community building approach could be scaled in really interesting ways. She outlined several ideas for content strategy, community expansion, and partnership development that reflected both her marketing expertise and her new understanding of our user base and mission. These weren't generic business development suggestions, but thoughtful proposals that took into account the unique characteristics of our market and the special responsibilities that came with serving vulnerable populations. Tom was studying the organizational chart and staffing projections. What about leadership development and succession planning? He asked. You've built something remarkable, but sustainable growth requires building systems and teams that can operate independently of any single founder. I explained our approach to talent acquisition, leadership development, and organizational structure. Emma Thompson had been critical in building our technical capabilities, while Marcus Johnson had developed our user experience and community management frameworks. We were actively recruiting for additional senior leadership positions, including a chief medical officer and a VP of strategic partnerships. The goal is to build something that can outlast and outgrow my personal involvement, I said. My experience as a brain injury survivor was essential for getting MindBridge started, but the platform's long-term success depends on building a team and organization that can serve our users better than any individual founder could. David was nodding approvingly, his construction background helping him understand the importance of building solid foundations for long-term growth. That's exactly the right approach, he said. The most successful businesses are the ones that become bigger than their founders. As the meeting wound down, Jake pulled out his phone and opened his calendar application. I'd like to schedule some follow-up conversations about potential investment opportunities and strategic partnerships, he said. Not as family, but as professional colleagues who might be able to contribute to what you're building here. The transformation was complete. A week earlier, Jake had been offering to help me manage what remained of my inheritance after my poor decisions. Now he was exploring investment opportunities in the company I'd built with that same inheritance. The brain surgery that was supposed to have limited my future prospects had instead revealed entrepreneurial capabilities that none of us had previously recognized. Rebecca was gathering her materials with the focused energy of someone who'd identified an exciting professional opportunity. I'm going to put together a comprehensive marketing strategy proposal, she said. Not because you're my brother, but because MindBridge represents exactly the kind of authentic, mission-driven brand that our agency specializes in supporting. Tom was studying the expansion timeline and market penetration projections. The growth trajectory reminds me of the early days of the Denver real estate boom, he said. When you identify an underserved market with significant need and limited competition, the opportunities can be extraordinary. As everyone prepared to leave, Linda approached me with an expression that mixed pride, amazement, and a hint of lingering maternal concern. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished, she said quietly. But I want you to promise me that you won't sacrifice your health for business success. You've already proven everything you need to prove. I hugged her, understanding that her protective instincts would always be part of how she related to me, regardless of my professional achievements or business success. Building MindBridge has been good for my health, I assured her. Having purpose and meaningful work has been more therapeutic than any of the formal treatment programs. David lingered after everyone else had left, apparently wanting a private conversation similar to the one we'd had the previous Sunday. We stood on the back deck again, looking out at the same mountain views, but the context of our discussion was completely different. I've been thinking about that message Rebecca sent, he said, quietly. The one about inheritance. It's bothered me all week, knowing that while you were fighting for your life, some family members were already thinking about dividing up your assets. I'd been wondering when someone would address the elephant in the room directly. The cruel calculation behind Rebecca's message had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the moment that had shown me exactly what my family thought of my prospects and my value. It hurt, I admitted. But it also clarified something important. I realized that I needed to prove my worth not just to myself, but to people who had already written me off. And that motivation, as painful as it was, helped drive everything I accomplished during recovery. David shook his head. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to anyone. We should have believed in your potential regardless of the surgery or the recovery challenges. I appreciated his acknowledgement, even as I recognized that the family's lack of faith had inadvertently contributed to my success. If they'd been supportive and encouraging from the beginning, I might not have felt the urgency to build something extraordinary. The dismissal and underestimation had created a pressure that had ultimately been productive, even if it had been painful at the time. Maybe everything happened the way it needed to happen, I said. The surgery, the recovery, the family dynamics, even Rebecca's message. Maybe I needed all of those challenges to discover what I was really capable of creating. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed in just 1 week. 7 days earlier, I'd been the family member who needed protection and guidance. Now I was being treated as a successful entrepreneur whose expertise and experience were valued and respected. The brain surgery that was supposed to have diminished me had instead revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The family that had once doubted my judgment was now seeking my business advice, and the inheritance they'd been so eager to redistribute had become the foundation for something much more valuable than any of them had imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new conversations about the future of MindBridge technologies. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, I felt completely confident about who I was, what I'd accomplished, and where I was heading. Part 5. The following weeks unfolded with a momentum that felt almost surreal after months of careful, measured recovery. Media coverage of MindBridge had attracted attention from healthcare systems across the country, venture capital firms specializing in digital health, and technology companies looking for acquisition opportunities. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, partnership proposals, and speaking invitations that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. The Forbes article had been particularly impactful, focusing on the intersection of personal adversity and entrepreneurial innovation. Patricia Chen had crafted a narrative that highlighted both the business achievement and the human story behind it, creating exactly the kind of authentic, compelling content that resonated with readers facing their own challenges and setbacks. Emma knocked on my office door Tuesday morning with a tablet full of metrics that perfectly captured how dramatically our visibility had increased. Website traffic was up 400% from the previous month. New user registrations had doubled in just 2 weeks. Most importantly, the quality of our user base remained high, with engagement rates and retention metrics staying strong even as our community grew rapidly. The healthcare partnerships are accelerating faster than we projected, she said, scrolling through a list of hospitals and rehabilitation centers that had reached out about pilot programs. Denver Health wants to start a formal collaboration. The Cleveland Clinic is interested in licensing our assessment tools. And we got a call from Johns Hopkins about research partnership opportunities. I reviewed the partnership proposals while sipping coffee and thinking about how to manage growth without compromising the personal touch that made MindBridge effective. These institutional relationships could provide credibility and scale, but they also brought complexity and potential conflicts with our community-centered approach. What's the timeline for the Cleveland Clinic discussion? I asked, already mentally preparing for the kind of detailed technical and clinical conversations that would be required for a partnership with such a prestigious medical institution. They want to schedule a presentation for next Friday, Emma replied. Full leadership team, including their chief medical officer and director of digital innovation. They're particularly interested in our outcome tracking capabilities and community engagement metrics. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now preparing for presentations at world-renowned medical institutions, while my family had recently been debating whether I was ready to manage basic daily responsibilities. The brain surgery that was supposed to have limited my cognitive capabilities had instead led to opportunities that exceeded anything I'd achieved before the accident. Marcus Johnson appeared in my doorway with a laptop showing the latest user feedback analysis. Our community management team had been tracking sentiment and engagement patterns, looking for early indicators of problems or opportunities for improvement. The data consistently showed high satisfaction rates and strong emotional connection to the platform. There's something interesting in the demographic breakdown, Marcus said, opening a series of charts and graphs. We're seeing significant adoption among family members and caregivers, not just primary users dealing with brain injuries. The support network features are creating value for entire families navigating recovery challenges. This finding suggested opportunities for expansion that we hadn't fully considered during our initial development phase. Brain injury recovery affected not just individuals, but entire family systems, creating ripple effects of stress, confusion, and resource needs that weren't adequately addressed by traditional medical approaches. The caregiver market could be enormous, I said, thinking about my own family's experience during my recovery period. They're dealing with their own emotional and practical challenges while trying to support someone else's healing process. We spent the next hour discussing product development opportunities that could better serve the broader ecosystem of people affected by neurological trauma. The conversation highlighted how much we'd learned about our users and their needs, knowledge that was now informing strategic decisions about platform evolution and market expansion. Part 3 Continuation. Rebecca called just before lunch, her voice bubbling with excitement about a marketing strategy presentation she'd been preparing. Alex, I think I've identified some incredible opportunities for community expansion and brand partnerships, she said. Can we schedule a formal strategy session this week? I want to show you what I've developed. The enthusiasm in her voice was genuine, but it also represented a complete reversal from her attitude just 2 weeks earlier. Then she'd been concerned about my ability to handle basic decisions and stressful situations. Now she was eager to collaborate on aggressive growth strategies for a multi-million-dollar technology platform. Thursday afternoon works, I replied, checking my calendar while simultaneously reviewing partnership proposals from 3 different healthcare systems. But Rebecca, I want to make sure we're aligned on the unique challenges of marketing in this space. Our users aren't typical consumers making discretionary purchases. She assured me that her research had been comprehensive, covering healthcare marketing regulations, patient privacy considerations, and the ethical complexities of serving vulnerable populations. The thoroughness of her preparation impressed me, even as it highlighted how dramatically her perception of my capabilities had evolved. The afternoon brought a video conference with potential investors from Chicago, a venture capital firm specializing in healthcare technology, with a particular focus on platforms that demonstrated measurable patient outcomes. They'd been following MindBridge's growth trajectory for several weeks, conducting due diligence on our financial metrics, user engagement data, and competitive positioning. The retention rates are exceptional, said Jennifer Walsh, the firm's managing partner, scrolling through analytics dashboards on her screen. 93% monthly retention in a healthcare application is remarkable, especially considering the emotional and physical challenges your users are facing. I explained that the high retention reflected the genuine value proposition of the platform, rather than artificial engagement strategies. Users stayed with MindBridge because it provided tools and community support that weren't available anywhere else, not because of gamification or loyalty programs designed to manipulate behavior. Our success metrics are ultimately about user outcomes rather than just engagement, I continued. We track recovery progress, quality of life improvements, and community connection indicators. The business metrics follow naturally from creating genuine value for people during difficult transitions. The investors were particularly interested in our expansion strategy and the potential for scaling beyond brain injury recovery. They could see the broader market opportunity in neurological rehabilitation and recovery support, understanding that MindBridge had developed capabilities that could be adapted for various conditions and recovery scenarios. What's your timeline for launching additional verticals? Asked Michael Chen, the firm's healthcare technology specialist. Stroke recovery, traumatic brain injury, neurodegenerative diseases. The addressable market could be enormous. I outlined our phased expansion plan, which prioritized careful research and community input over rapid market penetration. We'd learned that healthcare technology required different approaches than typical consumer applications, with longer development cycles but much higher user loyalty and outcome impact. We're not trying to be everything to everyone immediately, I explained. We'd rather build deep, meaningful solutions for specific populations than shallow, generic tools that don't really address anyone's needs effectively. The conversation continued for 90 minutes, covering technical architecture, regulatory compliance, competitive analysis, and potential partnership structures. By the end of the call, both sides were interested in exploring a more formal relationship, though the specific terms and timeline would require additional discussion. Emma appeared in my office doorway as I was wrapping up notes from the investor call. The Johns Hopkins research team confirmed their visit for next Tuesday, she said. They want to discuss collaborative studies on cognitive recovery assessment and community support effectiveness. The prospect of working with Johns Hopkins represented validation from one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. Their interest in MindBridge suggested that our approach to recovery support was gaining credibility within the academic medical community, opening doors for research partnerships that could enhance our clinical evidence base. What's their specific research focus? I asked, already thinking about how academic collaboration might inform our product development and outcome measurement strategies. They're particularly interested in quantifying the impact of peer support and community engagement on neurological recovery trajectories, Emma replied. Apparently, there's limited research on how social connection affects clinical outcomes and brain injury recovery. This represented exactly the kind of research that could differentiate MindBridge from other healthcare applications. If we could demonstrate statistically significant improvements in recovery outcomes through rigorous academic studies, the platform would become much more attractive to healthcare systems, insurance providers, and medical professionals. The remainder of the afternoon was consumed by product development meetings, user experience reviews, and customer support analysis. Our team had grown to 18 full-time employees, with additional contractors working on specialized projects, including mobile application development, clinical assessment tools, and international localization. The scale and complexity of the operation would have seemed impossible during my early recovery months, when my family was debating whether I could handle the cognitive demands of basic daily planning. Now I was managing multiple development teams, strategic partnerships, investor relations, and expansion initiatives simultaneously. Dr. Williams called just as I was preparing to leave the office, his voice carrying the warmth and professional satisfaction of a surgeon whose patient had exceeded all expectations. Alex, I've been following the media coverage of MindBridge with great interest, he said. What you've accomplished is remarkable, both from a business perspective and from a recovery standpoint. I appreciated his acknowledgement, particularly given his role in making my recovery possible in the first place. The platform development actually became an important part of my healing process, I told him. Having meaningful work to focus on, something that could help other people facing similar challenges, provided motivation and purpose during the most difficult months. He was calling to discuss the possibility of MindBridge collaborating with his neurosurgery department on patient education and post-operative support initiatives. The hospital had been looking for ways to improve recovery outcomes and reduce readmission rates, and our platform offered tools that could address both objectives. Traditional post-surgical care focuses primarily on medical complications and physical therapy, Dr. Williams explained. But there's growing recognition that cognitive recovery and emotional support are equally important for optimal outcomes. We spent 20 minutes discussing potential collaboration models, outcome measurement approaches, and implementation strategies. By the end of our conversation, we'd outlined a pilot program that could begin within 6 weeks, providing MindBridge access to a controlled user population while giving the hospital data on recovery outcome improvements. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Mitchell construction projects were visible, reminders of the family business that had shaped my understanding of building something lasting and valuable. David's work created physical infrastructure that served communities for decades. Now I was building digital infrastructure that could serve recovery communities for generations. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom asking if I'd be interested in speaking at a Denver business development conference next month. Apparently, my story was resonating with entrepreneurs and business leaders dealing with their own challenges and setbacks. The invitation represented another opportunity to share lessons learned during the most difficult period of my life. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the day's activities and marveling at how completely my life had been transformed. 6 months earlier, I'd been lying in a hospital bed uncertain about my future prospects and capabilities. Now I was fielding partnership offers from major medical institutions and investment proposals from venture capital firms. The brain surgery that was supposed to have limited my potential had instead revealed entrepreneurial abilities I'd never known I possessed. The recovery period that should have been about returning to my previous life had become about building something entirely new and potentially transformative. And the family that had once questioned my judgment was now seeking my business expertise and professional guidance. My phone displayed another notification from the family group chat, but the tone of these messages had changed completely from the cruel inheritance speculation that had motivated so much of my recovery journey. Now the conversations focused on business development opportunities, strategic partnerships, and ways the family could support MindBridge's continued growth. Rebecca had sent a detailed outline of her marketing strategy presentation, complete with competitive analysis, user acquisition projections, and brand positioning recommendations. Jake had forwarded an article about healthcare technology valuation trends, with a note suggesting that MindBridge was positioned to benefit from increasing investor interest in the sector. Even Aunt Karen had contributed to the conversation, sharing information about intellectual property protection strategies and trademark registration processes that could be important as we expanded into new markets and developed additional products. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the family member who needed protection and careful management of expectations. I was the entrepreneur whose expertise and achievements were valued and respected by people who had known me long before brain surgery had changed everything. Part 4 Continuation. The following morning brought news that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Emma burst into my office with her laptop open to a breaking news story on TechCrunch, with a headline that made me stop breathing for a moment. MindBridge Technologies emerges as leading platform in $15 billion neurological recovery market. The article detailed our growth trajectory, user outcome metrics, and recent funding round, but it also positioned MindBridge within the broader context of digital health innovation and aging population demographics. According to their analysis, the market for neurological recovery support was expected to triple over the next decade, as baby boomers aged and medical technology improved survival rates for various brain injuries. "They're calling us a category creator," Emma said, scrolling through the article's detailed analysis of our competitive positioning and market opportunity. And look at this quote from the Cleveland Clinic's chief medical officer: "MindBridge represents exactly the kind of patient-centered innovation that healthcare has been waiting for." I read through the article twice, absorbing the implications of being positioned as a market leader in a space I'd entered purely because of personal necessity. The platform I'd built to solve my own recovery challenges was now being analyzed as a strategic business opportunity with massive scaling potential. The phone started ringing immediately, with reporters requesting interviews, investors wanting to schedule meetings, and healthcare systems inquiring about partnership opportunities. Emma had to temporarily disable our main phone lines and route everything through a dedicated media relations service we'd contracted just for situations like this. "The hospital partnerships are accelerating beyond our projections," Marcus Johnson reported, joining us in my office with a tablet full of inquiry proposal requests. "Mayo Clinic wants to discuss a comprehensive collaboration. Stanford is interested in licensing our assessment algorithms. And we got a call from the Veterans Administration about potential system-wide implementation." The scope of interest was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Each partnership opportunity represented potential revenue, user growth, and validation of our approach, but they also brought complexity and resource requirements that would strain our current operational capacity. "We need to be strategic about which opportunities to pursue," I said, thinking about the importance of maintaining our core mission and user-centered approach, even as institutional interest accelerated. Growth for its own sake could undermine the authentic community connection that makes MindBridge effective. Emma nodded, understanding the delicate balance between business opportunity and mission integrity that characterized all our major decisions. "What if we developed a formal partnership evaluation framework, criteria that prioritize user benefit and outcome improvement over pure revenue potential?" I appreciated her suggestion, recognizing that systematic decision-making would be essential as opportunities multiplied beyond our ability to evaluate them individually. Let's schedule a strategy session for tomorrow morning. We need to get ahead of this growth curve before it overwhelms our capacity to manage thoughtfully. The morning continued with a stream of calls, emails, and meeting requests that reflected the sudden acceleration of everything we'd been building. Rebecca arrived unannounced just before lunch, carrying her marketing strategy presentation and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with barely controlled amazement. "Alex, do you realize what's happening?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk and opening her laptop. "The media coverage is creating awareness and credibility that would have taken years to build through traditional marketing approaches." She was right, though the irony wasn't lost on me, that our biggest marketing breakthrough had come from simply telling the truth about what we'd accomplished. The authentic founder story and genuine user outcomes had resonated with journalists and readers in ways that manufactured marketing campaigns rarely achieved. "The key is leveraging this momentum without compromising our core mission," I replied, remembering countless technology companies that had grown rapidly but lost their way in the process. "We need to scale our impact, not just our revenue." Rebecca launched into her presentation, which had evolved significantly from her initial marketing concepts. Now she was proposing integrated campaigns that emphasized community building, user education, and healthcare professional outreach rather than traditional advertising approaches. "The medical community is conservative about new technologies," she explained, displaying slides about healthcare adoption patterns and decision-making processes, "but they're also increasingly interested in solutions that demonstrate measurable patient outcomes and cost savings potential." Her analysis was sophisticated and well-researched, reflecting both her professional expertise and her growing understanding of our unique market position. She'd identified key opinion leaders in neurological rehabilitation, professional associations that could provide credibility, and medical conferences where MindBridge could reach decision-makers efficiently. "What about the family angle?" she asked, transitioning to a section about caregiver marketing. "The data shows that family members are often the ones researching recovery resources and making technology adoption decisions. How do we reach them effectively?" I explained our emerging understanding of the recovery ecosystem, which extended far beyond individual patients, to include family members, healthcare providers, insurance coordinators, and community support networks. Each group had different needs, concerns, and decision-making criteria that required tailored messaging and outreach approaches. "The platform succeeds when it serves everyone involved in recovery, not just the primary user," I continued. "Family members need education, support, and practical tools just as much as patients do." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering content strategy, partnership development, professional association engagement, and community growth initiatives. By the end of our meeting, Rebecca had a clear understanding of how marketing could support our mission while respecting the unique sensitivities of our user base. "I want to be part of this," she said as she gathered her materials, "not just as a family member, but as a marketing professional who believes in what you're building here." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, representing a complete transformation from her attitude during my early recovery months. Then she'd been concerned about protecting me from stress and disappointment. Now she was eager to contribute her expertise to something she recognized as genuinely important and professionally exciting. The afternoon brought a video conference with the Veterans Administration team that had expressed interest in pilot programs for service members dealing with traumatic brain injuries. Their population faced unique challenges related to combat trauma, military culture, and transition to civilian healthcare systems, but the core recovery support needs aligned closely with our existing capabilities. "The veteran community has strong peer support traditions," explained Colonel Patricia Morris, the VA's Director of Rehabilitation Services, "but those networks often struggle with geographic dispersion and varying levels of technical comfort. A platform like MindBridge could bridge those gaps effectively." I outlined how our community features could be adapted for military populations, with specific attention to privacy concerns, cultural considerations, and integration with existing VA support services. The conversation highlighted opportunities for customization and specialization that could enhance our platform's effectiveness for specific user groups. "What's your timeline for developing military-specific features?" asked Dr. James Rodriguez, the VA's Chief of Neurological Services. "We have funding available for pilot programs that demonstrate outcome improvements and cost-effectiveness." We discussed implementation strategies, outcome measurement protocols, and regulatory approval processes for the next 45 minutes. By the end of the call, both sides were committed to developing a formal partnership proposal that could begin pilot testing within 3 months. Emma appeared in my doorway as I was completing notes from the VA discussion. "The Johns Hopkins team just confirmed their research collaboration proposal," she said. "They want to launch a comprehensive study comparing recovery outcomes for MindBridge users versus traditional rehabilitation approaches." This represented exactly the kind of academic validation that could accelerate our credibility within the medical community. Peer-reviewed research demonstrating improved outcomes would make MindBridge much more attractive to healthcare systems, insurance providers, and medical professionals who required evidence-based justification for technology adoption. "What's the study design?" I asked, already thinking about the implications of rigorous outcome measurement and statistical analysis of our platform's effectiveness. "Randomized controlled trial with 6-month follow-up periods," Emma replied. "They want to track cognitive recovery, emotional well-being, community engagement, and overall quality of life indicators across multiple user populations." The scope and rigor of the proposed research exceeded anything we'd previously considered, but it also offered opportunities to demonstrate MindBridge's impact with the kind of scientific credibility that could transform our market position and scaling potential. As the day concluded, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary trajectory that had brought us to this point. 6 months earlier, I'd been recovering from brain surgery while my family debated my future prospects and inheritance distribution. Now we were fielding partnership offers from prestigious medical institutions and research proposals from leading academic centers. The platform I'd built to address my own recovery needs had evolved into something with the potential to transform neurological rehabilitation for thousands of people dealing with similar challenges. The personal necessity that had driven the initial development was now informing strategic decisions about market expansion and institutional partnerships. My phone buzzed with a text from David asking if I'd be available for dinner tomorrow evening. He wanted to discuss potential construction and facility development opportunities as MindBridge continued growing. The son he'd once worried about protecting from stress was now being consulted about business expansion and real estate strategy. The transformation was both surreal and deeply satisfying. Brain surgery hadn't diminished my capabilities or limited my future prospects. Instead, it had revealed entrepreneurial abilities and market insights that none of us had previously recognized, creating opportunities that exceeded anything I'd accomplished before the accident. Part 5, continuation. 3 weeks later, I stood on the observation deck of our new headquarters building, looking out at the Denver skyline while reviewing the final documents for our Series B funding round. 15 months after brain surgery, MindBridge Technologies had grown from a recovery project into a major player in the digital health industry, with partnerships spanning academic medical centers, healthcare systems, and government agencies. The view from the 42nd floor encompassed the entire metropolitan area, including the hospital where Dr. Williams had performed my surgery and the neighborhoods where my family had spent months debating my recovery prospects and future limitations. The physical elevation perfectly captured the professional and personal transformation that had defined this extraordinary year. Emma knocked on the conference room door, carrying the final partnership agreements from Johns Hopkins, the Cleveland Clinic, and Stanford Medical Center. The collaborative research initiatives would provide academic credibility while generating outcome data that could accelerate our expansion into new markets and user populations. The research protocols are approved, she said, spreading the documents across the conference table. 6-month studies tracking recovery outcomes, community engagement metrics, and quality of life improvements. If the results match our internal data, we'll have peer-reviewed evidence that MindBridge significantly improves neurological recovery trajectories. I reviewed the study designs while mentally preparing for the board meeting that would conclude our Series B funding process. The $40 million investment round had attracted interest from healthcare-focused venture capital firms, strategic investors from major technology companies, and even family offices looking for opportunities in the rapidly growing digital health sector. The valuation is remarkable, Marcus Johnson said, joining us in the conference room with final user metrics and engagement analytics. 18 months ago, none of us imagined we'd be discussing a $400 million company valuation. The growth trajectory has exceeded every projection. The numbers were impressive, but they represented something more important than financial success. Each user on our platform was someone navigating recovery challenges similar to what I'd experienced after surgery. Every positive outcome metric meant that people were rebuilding their lives more effectively because of tools and community support that hadn't existed when I'd needed them most. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, now serving as our Director of Strategic Communications after formally joining MindBridge 3 months earlier. Her marketing expertise had been instrumental in managing our rapid growth while maintaining the authentic, mission-driven brand identity that resonated with users and healthcare professionals. The Forbes cover story is confirmed for next month, she said, settling into a chair with her tablet full of media schedules and interview requests. They want to focus on the intersection of personal adversity and entrepreneurial innovation, using MindBridge as a case study for how challenges can become competitive advantages. The media attention had been valuable for building awareness and credibility, but it also brought visibility that required careful management. Our user base included people dealing with vulnerable health conditions, and we had responsibilities to protect their privacy while sharing stories that could inspire others facing similar challenges. What's the approach for user testimonials? I asked, remembering the importance of balancing inspiring narratives with respect for individual privacy and dignity. Voluntary participation only, with comprehensive consent processes and editorial approval for all quoted content, Rebecca replied. We want authentic stories, but we also want users to feel completely in control of how their experiences are shared. The board meeting began at 2 o'clock, with investors participating both in person and via video conference from San Francisco, Boston, and New York. The Series B funding would support international expansion, additional clinical research, and platform development for new recovery populations, including stroke survivors, traumatic brain injury patients, and people dealing with neurodegenerative diseases. The market opportunity has expanded beyond our initial projections, explained Jennifer Walsh from our lead investor, Chicago Healthcare Ventures. Demographic trends and improving medical technology are creating demand for recovery support platforms that could serve millions of users globally. I presented our expansion strategy, which prioritized careful research and community input over rapid market penetration. The approach had served us well during our initial growth phase, maintaining high user satisfaction and outcome metrics even as our community expanded dramatically. We're building infrastructure for long-term impact rather than short-term growth, I explained to the board members. Each new market requires deep understanding of local healthcare systems, cultural considerations, and regulatory environments. We'd rather launch thoughtfully than scale carelessly. The investors appreciated our methodical approach, recognizing that healthcare technology required different strategies than typical consumer applications. User trust and clinical credibility were more valuable than rapid user acquisition, and outcome improvements were more important than engagement metrics. David had driven down from the construction site where Mitchell Construction was building a new medical facility, arriving just as the board meeting concluded. He'd become one of our informal advisors, providing perspective on facility development, operational scaling, and the practical challenges of managing rapid growth. The new headquarters is impressive, he said, looking around the conference room with its mountain views and modern technology infrastructure. When you first told us about MindBridge, I never imagined it would grow into something requiring this kind of space and resources. I appreciated his acknowledgement, remembering how dramatically his perception of my capabilities had evolved over the past year. The brain surgery that had initially terrified him as a limitation on my future prospects had instead revealed entrepreneurial abilities that none of us had previously recognized. The platform succeeded because it addressed real needs that weren't being met anywhere else, I replied. Personal experience with recovery challenges gave us insights that wouldn't have been available through traditional market research or product development approaches. Tom arrived for our scheduled dinner meeting, carrying financial analysis documents and investment portfolio projections that reflected his growing involvement in MindBridge's strategic planning. His real estate expertise had proven valuable for facilities planning, market expansion analysis, and partnership evaluation. The healthcare technology sector is attracting incredible investment interest, he said, reviewing charts showing venture capital funding trends and acquisition valuations. But most platforms struggle with user retention and outcome demonstration. MindBridge has solved both challenges through authentic community building and evidence-based development. The dinner conversation covered expansion opportunities, competitive analysis, and long-term strategic planning. My family members were now engaging with MindBridge as business colleagues rather than concerned relatives, offering professional expertise and strategic guidance based on their respective areas of specialization. Linda had prepared a celebration dinner at the family home, with the entire extended family gathering to acknowledge the completion of our Series B funding round. The atmosphere was completely different from the protective concern that had characterized family meetings during my recovery period. To Alex, Uncle Tom said, raising his glass in a toast, for proving that our biggest challenges can become our greatest opportunities. The sentiment was generous, though I reflected on how much the family dynamic had been transformed by business success. The brain surgery that had initially prompted worried discussions about my limitations and future prospects was now viewed as the catalyst for extraordinary achievement. To second chances, I replied, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. And to families who learn to see potential where they once saw only problems. Aunt Karen approached me after dinner with a photo she'd found while organizing family documents. It showed me at age 12, working on an early computer programming project with intense concentration and obvious enthusiasm. Even then, apparently, I'd been drawn to technology solutions and problem-solving approaches. I think the entrepreneurial instincts were always there, she said. The brain surgery didn't create your abilities, it just revealed them under extraordinary circumstances. Her observation resonated with me as I considered the complex relationship between adversity and achievement. The accident and surgery had certainly changed my life trajectory, but perhaps they'd also forced me to discover capabilities and resilience that might have remained dormant under normal circumstances. Jake pulled me aside for a private conversation about investment opportunities and portfolio diversification strategies. His financial services background had helped him understand MindBridge's market position and growth potential, and he was exploring ways to participate in our continued expansion. The company you've built represents exactly the kind of investment opportunity I spend my career helping clients identify, he said. Mission-driven, scalable, addressing underserved markets with demonstrated demand. It's remarkable that this all started with a personal recovery project. I appreciated his professional recognition, remembering how different our conversations had been during my early recovery months, when he'd been focused on helping me manage what remained of my inheritance after my poor decisions. As the evening concluded, I found myself surrounded by family members who were now eager to support and contribute to something they recognized as genuinely important and professionally impressive. The protective concern had been replaced by genuine respect and collaborative enthusiasm. Rebecca walked with me to my car, carrying materials for the marketing strategy review we'd scheduled for the following week. Alex, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished, she said. But I also want to apologize for that message I sent while you were in surgery. It was cruel and thoughtless, and I'm ashamed that I ever wrote something like that. Her apology was sincere, though I'd long since moved beyond anger about her inheritance speculation. If anything, that moment of cruel clarity had provided motivation and focus that had contributed to everything I'd accomplished since. The message hurt, I admitted, but it also showed me exactly what I needed to prove and to whom. Maybe I needed that kind of clarity to discover what I was really capable of creating. As I drove home through the Denver streets, past construction sites where my father's company was building infrastructure for future generations, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had defined this year. Brain surgery that was supposed to have limited my potential had instead revealed entrepreneurial abilities that exceeded anything I'd previously accomplished. The family that had once questioned my judgment was now seeking my business expertise. The inheritance they'd been eager to redistribute had become the foundation for something worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the recovery period that should have been about returning to my previous life had become about building something entirely new and potentially transformative. My phone displayed a notification from our user community, a message from someone in Portland whose recovery journey had been supported by connections and resources they'd found through MindBridge. These personal impact stories remained the most meaningful measure of our success, beyond valuations, funding rounds, or media coverage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new conversations about the future of neurological recovery support. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, I felt completely confident about who I was, what I'd accomplished, and where the journey would lead next. The brain surgery that was supposed to have broken me had instead shown me what I was really capable of when everything else was stripped away. Sometimes our greatest limitations become our most powerful sources of innovation and achievement. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.